Come on, this way!
Where are you going? The barracks is through here!
It has been an honor, Jarl Ulfric.
Ulfric Stormcloak. Some here in Helgen call you a hero, but a hero doesn't use a power like the voice to murder his king and usurp his throne.
It's been 15 years since the release of Skyrim. And still, one debate rages on. Stormcloaks or Imperials? Was Ulfric right to start the war? Should Skyrim fight for freedom? Or did it fracture when humanity could least afford it? 15 years later, we still don't agree. So I'm here to settle it. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. Today we're going to finally tackle the Skyrim Civil War debate. Who should win, who you should choose, and what actually makes sense as the canon ending. I've been going back and forth with you guys in the comments for a while now, and I recently ran a poll to see where everyone stands, and the split is pretty interesting. So what I want to do here is take the strongest and most common arguments from both sides, lay them out clearly, walk through them one by one, and I'll say whether I think they hold up, where I think they fall apart, and in the end, I'll give my overall conclusion. I'll try to be as unbiased as possible, but I do have my own opinions. I'll try to take the emotion out of the arguments and evaluate them based on their merit. Before we get too far into that, I want to shore a couple things up front. This is a debate about a fictional civil war in a video game. Keep that in perspective. Argue hard if you want in the comments, but please be respectful. There isn't some objective moral truth hiding behind this. A lot of where you land probably depends on where you see yourself in Tamriel. If you only play Imperials, you may naturally sympathize with the Empire. If you always play a Nord, the Stormcloaks might feel like your people. This bias is normal. Just be aware this might apply to you or other people commenting. And there is one crutch I want to remove right away because I think it kind of muddies most of the arguments. We are not factoring in what side the Dragonborn chose. We're not allowing the argument of my level 80 stealth assassin solos the Aldmeri Dominion by himself. No chosen one advantage is tipping the scales. If we're going to ask who should win in canon, we have to evaluate Skyrim without a god-tier protagonist deciding the outcome. Otherwise, the debate kind of becomes meaningless. Also, if you enjoy this kind of long-form breakdown, subscribe. I post deep dives like this every week, and the comment sections on these are always some of the best discussions on the channel. Drop your takes below, and I will try to respond to as many of you as I can. And lastly, if you want to support the studio directly, wishlist Winter Reach Emporium on Steam. The link is in the description. It's set in our own fantasy world, and it takes place on a ski shop on a mountain peak. Even if you never buy it, the wishlist helps more than you think. Alright, let's get into it. And to understand the argument, we have to talk about what came first. The Great War and its aftermath. The Great War began in the Fourth Era in the year 171, and it lasted for 4 years. It was fought between the Third Empire of Tamriel and the Aldmeri Dominion. The Thalmor referred to it as the First War Against the Empire, which implies they never saw it as a final conflict. To understand the war, you have to understand the state of the Empire beforehand. After the Oblivion Crisis, Tamriel was destabilized. In Somerset, the Thalmor consolidated power and rebranded the Isles as Alinor. They seized control of Valenwood in a coup, elsewhere fractured during the Void Knight crisis, and became effectively aligned with the Dominion. Black Marsh had already left Imperial control. Morrowind had been devastated by the eruption of Red Mountain. By the time Titus Mede II took the throne in the Fourth Era, 168, the Empire had lost multiple provinces and was significantly weaker than it had been under the Septums. On the 30th of Frostfall, 171, the Aldmeri Dominion delivered the ultimatum to the Imperial city. The demands included a heavy tribute, the disbanding of the Blades, the outlawing of Talos worship, and the cession of large portions of Hammerfell. Despite warnings from his generals that the Empire was not prepared for war, Titus Mede II rejected the ultimatum. When the Emperor rejected the ultimatum, the Thalmor ambassador overturned a covered cart in the Imperial court. Inside were the severed heads of every Blades agent operating in the Dominion territory. War began almost immediately. The Dominion launched a simultaneous invasion. One force under Lord Narfin marched north from elsewhere into Cyrodiil. Leyawind fell quickly, Bravil was besieged, and Anvil and other cities soon followed. The second major force, under Lady Aranella, advanced from Valenwood into western Cyrodiil, and then pushed into Hammerfell, and a smaller Dominion force landed alongside Hammerfell's southern coastline. Hammerfell was politically divided at the time. between the crowns and the forebears, and resistance was disorganized. Much of southern Hammerfell fell quickly. Imperial forces retreated across the Alakir Desert in what became known as the March of the Thirst. By the end of the first year of war, the Dominion had pushed deep into Cyrodiil. By the end of that year, Lord Narfen's forces reached the walls of the Imperial city. In the year 174 of the Fourth Era, the Aldmeri committed their full strength to a decisive assault. The Imperial city was surrounded and eventually taken. The sack of the Imperial city followed. The White-Gold Tower was looted and the capital was burned. Rather than make a final stand inside of the city, Titus Mede II chose to break out with his remaining forces and retreat north, linking up with reinforcements from Skyrim. One of his legions was sacrificed to hold the enemy while he escaped. In Hammerfell, General Desenius had been ordered to march east to reinforce Cyrodiil. Unwilling to abandon Hammerfell entirely, he discharged a large portion of his troops as invalids. These veterans remained behind and became the backbone of Hammerfell's continued resistance. During the winter of 174 to 175, Titus Mede regrouped. Reinforcements from Skyrim and Hammerfell joined his army. The Emperor deliberately encouraged the Dominion to believe he was preparing to surrender, buying time to assemble his forces. The counterattack came in what is known as the Battle of Red Ring. The Emperor divided his army into three forces. One swept from the west, one swept from the east, and the main force attacked from the north. The Aldmeri army occupying the Imperial city was surrounded, Lord Narfen was captured, and the Dominion's primary force in Cyrodiil was destroyed. On paper, this seems like a decisive Imperial victory. However, the Empire had been devastated. Its legions were exhausted, large portions of Cyrodiil and Hammerfell were in ruins, the capital had been sacked, and the Empire had no reserves left for another sustained campaign. At the end of 175, Titus Mede signed the White-Gold Concordat. The treaty included many of the same concessions originally demanded before the war. The banning of Talos worship, the disbanding of the Blades, the cession of large parts of southern Hammerfell to the Dominion. After the agreement, the Blades were formally dissolved. Survivors either went into hiding or returned to old Dragonguard traditions. Talos worship was outlawed across the Empire. In practice, enforcement was uneven at first, and that changed later, particularly due to the Markarth Incident, when Thalmor Justiciars were permitted to enforce the ban more directly. Hammerfell refused to accept the Concordat's territorial concessions. As a result, the Empire formally renounced Hammerfell as a province. Hammerfell continued fighting the Dominion alone for 5 more years and eventually reached a separate treaty, the Second Treaty of Stros-Makai, after pushing the Aldmeri to a stalemate. Critics of Titus Mede II will point to Hammerfell's eventual resistance as the evidence that the Dominion could have been defeated without signing the Concordat. Supporters argue that the Imperial armies were in no condition to continue the war, and that prolonging it would have led to a total collapse. In my own opinion, it seems the Empire snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. However, the aftermath of the Great War reshaped Tamriel. The Empire survived, but diminished. Hammerfell was independent and bitter towards Cyrodiil. The Blades were broken, Talos worship was banned, the Thalmor had gained political access inside of Imperial territory, and although the war had ended, both sides began preparing for what many believed would be another conflict. By the time Skyrim begins, this is the world we're stepping into. A weakened empire and a resentful Skyrim. The Civil War does not happen in a vacuum. That's why I thought it was so important to understand what came before it. Next, we'll do a quick refresher on the Markarth Incident, and then we will jump into the arguments. The Markarth Incident took place after the Great War, when the Empire had pulled many of its own forces out of Skyrim to fight the Aldmeri Dominion. During that absence, the Reachmen seized control of Markarth and the surrounding Reach, holding it for roughly 2 years. After the war ended, the Nord Jarl of Markarth sought help to retake the city. Ulfric Stormcloak led a militia and successfully drove the Reachmen out. In return, he demanded that Talos worship be openly permitted in Markarth, despite the White-Gold Concordat's ban. Talos worship resumed publicly in the city. This violated the terms of the Concordat. The Thalmor intervened and pressured the Empire to enforce the treaty. The Emperor ultimately complied. Ulfric was arrested by the Empire, Talos worship was suppressed again, and Thalmor Justiciars were allowed greater authority to enforce the ban. For many Nords, this was the breaking point. Ulfric had reclaimed the city under an agreement that was later reversed. The incident became a symbol of Imperial weakness and Thalmor influence inside of Skyrim. That resentment would eventually grow into open rebellion. Okay, so I think we have enough background to understand the situation. There's a little bit more we'll cover later for their specific arguments, but we're good to jump off from here. And the best place to start when it comes to arguments for the Stormcloaks or Imperials is the start of the game. One argument that I see constantly glazed over is the fact that you're literally about to be summarily executed by the Imperials. You're not on Hadvar's list, there is no investigation, no trial, and no verification of identity beyond the list. Without a complete act of time travel and a god, the Dragonborn story ends here. For many players, their first time playing the game and not knowing any other background about either side, this is compelling enough to make you choose the Stormcloaks. Why would I side with the people who are going to wrongfully execute me, despite knowing that they shouldn't? Many moral arguments are made against the Stormcloaks, but the constant hand-waving of the fact that you're going to be executed by the Imperials, if not for Alduin rescuing you, is shocking to me. Surely, if it were the Stormcloaks who were going to execute you, this would be the biggest argument for the Imperials. Another thing to consider is, if you were about to be executed summarily, that would imply that the Imperials have been doing this regularly. How many innocent border crossers have the Imperials executed before you? How many do they execute after you? These are questions that you have to ask, contend with, and explain if you pick the Imperials. This cannot be overlooked, and I think that this is a huge point for the Stormcloaks. Next, we get to the moment that actually ignites the Civil War. Ulfric Stormcloak kills High King Torygg. The Stormcloak argument is straightforward. Ulfric challenged Torygg to a duel under ancient Nordic customs. The High King accepted, the duel was lawful, Ulfric won, end of story. In Nord tradition, the High King is not an absolute monarch. Power is tied to strength and legitimacy. If a challenger defeats the High King in honorable combat, that challenger has a claim. From that perspective, Ulfric didn't assassinate King Torygg, he followed the cultural precedent. But there are some complications. First, Torygg was young and politically inexperienced. Multiple sources in game suggest he respected Ulfric and may have been sympathetic towards his views. Some accounts even imply that if Ulfric had approached him politically instead of through violence, he might have gained influence without bloodshed. Second, Ulfric did not simply fight Torygg with steel. He used the Thu'um. He shouted the High King apart before even delivering the final blow. Is the voice allowed under Nordic custom? Technically, yes. The voice is part of Nord heritage, but it dramatically shifts the power dynamic of the duel. Torygg was not trained in the tongue, and Ulfric was. Then there's the political consequence. Even if the duel was lawful under ancient custom, the Empire did not recognize it as a legitimate transfer of power. Skyrim is still formally part of the Empire. Killing a sitting High King without Imperial sanction during a period of instability guarantees escalation. And that's exactly what happened. Ulfric didn't just remove Torygg, he fractured Skyrim's Jarls. He forced every hold to choose sides. He created an internal war at a time where the Dominion was watching closely. So the question becomes this: was Ulfric acting as a traditional Nord asserting a rightful challenge? Or was he prioritizing symbolic strength over political stability? If the goal is independence at any cost, his action makes sense. If the goal is preserving Skyrim in a world where the Aldmeri Dominion is preparing for another war, killing the High King may have been the worst possible timing. I'm very split on this issue. On one hand, Nord heritage and culture is about being strong. The duel exists for a reason. There's no rule against the Thu'um, so therefore, in theory, Ulfric did nothing wrong. On the other hand, dueling a young and experienced High King, knowing he has no chance, and as sources in the game suggest, may have been sympathetic to Ulfric's side anyway, seems like an unnecessary symbolic move. It's not clear whether this act alone destabilized Skyrim or the declaration of rebellion, but a weakened Skyrim serves no one. If the possibility existed that Skyrim could have convinced Torygg to declare independence for all of Skyrim, surely that would have been the better move. And lastly, back to the topic of wrongful executions. When you first enter Solitude, Rogvir is executed. Rogvir allowed Ulfric to escape. I've seen the point put out before that Rogvir is not wrongfully executed, but the fact remains that Ulfric did not break any law by going and challenging Torygg to a duel which he won, whether it was by the Thu'um or not. I thought this should be laid out plainly to establish the pattern of wrongful executions by the Empire. To reiterate, under Skyrim's law, Ulfric did not do anything illegal by challenging Torygg and killing him. With that being said, I do find this to be one of the more compelling Imperial arguments. If by chance Torygg would have joined the rebellion and seceded all of Skyrim in one go, this would have been the best outcome. With that being said, this argument still hinges on the fact that the best outcome would be Skyrim independence in this scenario. The next argument is one of the most prevalent arguments, and I find to be the weakest argument. Are the Stormcloaks racist, or more specifically, is Ulfric racist? The evidence people point to is Windhelm. The Dunmer live in the Grey Quarter, the Argonians are not allowed inside city walls and work on the docks. NPC dialogue reflects hostility towards elves and outsiders. Some Stormcloak supporters openly use xenophobic rhetoric. But we need to separate rhetoric from policy and cultural context. First, Khajiit caravans are banned from entering all cities in Skyrim, not just Stormcloak cities: Whiterun, Solitude, Markarth, and Riften. All of them keep Khajiits outside of city walls. This policy is province-wide, not uniquely Stormcloak. Surely by this logic, every city, including the Imperial ones, are also racist. Second, the Dunmer-Argonian divide in Windhelm doesn't exist in a vacuum. The Dunmer historically enslaved Argonians for centuries. In the late 3rd Era and early 4th Era, Argonians revolted. After the Red Year devastated Morrowind, Argonians invaded, parts of it in retaliation. Many Dunmer fled to Skyrim as refugees, many of them potentially slave masters themselves. When Argonians are kept separate from Dunmer in Windhelm, it can be read as racial prejudice. It can also be read as an attempt to prevent open conflict between two groups with a recent history of enslavement and war. The game does not present it cleanly as one or the other. Is Windhelm a tolerant city? Maybe not. Is it a multicultural city? Certainly. Is it uniquely racist compared to the rest of Tamriel? Certainly not. Skyrim as a whole is culturally Nord dominant. The Stormcloak movement amplifies that identity. It does not invent it. Now the harder question, does Ulfric himself push a racial ideology? There's very little to no direct evidence that Ulfric is campaigning on racial purity. His rhetoric centers on Nord sovereignty and Talos worship. Not to mention, you can join the Stormcloak Rebellion as any race. That conflicts with the idea that the rebellion is explicitly racial in doctrine. The Stormcloak movement is nationalist, and nationalist movements often carry xenophobic undercurrents. That's a fair criticism. But if we're going to judge them for that, we need to apply the same scrutiny to the Empire. Is the Empire racist? Certainly. Is it imperialist? It obviously is. The Empire's entire history is conquest. Tiber Septim unified Tamriel through war. Provinces were subdued militarily, resistance was crushed, cities were destroyed. The Empire is not a voluntary federation in origin. It is an imperial project. The armistice with Morrowind is a strong example. After defeating the Dunmer forces and devastating Mournhold, Tiber Septim negotiated with Vivec. The terms allowed Morrowind to retain cultural autonomy, religious authority, and importantly, the right to continue practicing slavery. The Empire protected Dunmer slavery under the armistice. It is not a rumor, it is part of a lore treaty. The Empire outlawed necromancy, it stationed legions, it demanded the surrender of the Numidium, but it allowed slavery to continue because maintaining political stability was more important than enforcing moral reform. So if the criticism of the Stormcloaks is that they tolerate prejudice, the counterpoint is that the Empire has historically tolerated slavery and local oppression in exchange for political unity. The Empire may present itself as cosmopolitan and inclusive, and in many ways it is. But its inclusivity has always been strategic. Provinces are permitted to keep their customs as long as they remain loyal. The Empire doesn't erase local identity, it absorbs it. That absorption has included house wars, Morag-Tong assassins, religious persecution within Morrowind, and institutionalized slavery. The reason I say this is the weakest argument is because there's actually not any evidence that the Stormcloak movement itself is racist. And on the contrary, the Empire is inherently an imperialistic, conquering force that tolerates racism for their own gain. And one other point that I think gets glossed over a lot in fantasy racism is not the same as real-world racism. The races in Tamriel are starkly different from each other. In the real world, races differ on skin color and maybe a few other tiny tweaks. Aside from that, real-world races are almost entirely the same. Compare a Nord to an Argonian and a High Elf, and you can find that it is not even a comparison. Fantasy racism is exactly that. Fantasy racism. It cannot be conflated with real-world racism. That's just a tiny point. It's not really the crux of the argument. I just think it's a fun thing to consider, and it's not commonly talked about. Up next is one of the more compelling arguments for the Imperials, and it's the argument, could Skyrim survive on its own? And this argument breaks down into three separate questions. Could Skyrim survive on its own? Could the Empire survive without Skyrim? And if the Empire falls, does Skyrim fall with it? They're all related, but they're not the same thing. So let's start with the first one. Could Skyrim survive independently? And I think it's a lot closer than people actually assume. On paper, Skyrim is outmatched. The Aldmeri Dominion controls Somerset, Valenwood, and elsewhere. In terms of total population and available manpower, they outscale Skyrim significantly. A unified empire fields more troops than Skyrim alone ever could. But wars aren't just numbers. The geography matters. Skyrim is extremely far from Alinor. Any invasion would require sustained naval logistics across open water, followed by land campaigns through either High Rock or Cyrodiil or northern coastal landings. Naval invasions are complicated. They require staging grounds, supply lines, and sustained reinforcements. You can't just land an army and expect it to hold without constant resupply. Skyrim is also surrounded by mountains and natural choke points. Any southern advance has to push through narrow passes. Any western advance through High Rock creates new diplomatic complications. Any invasion through Cyrodiil would mean that the Dominion has already defeated or bypassed the Empire first. For the Dominion to seriously invade Skyrim, one of two things must already be true. Either the Empire has fallen, or the Empire has allowed Dominion forces to push through its territory. Neither scenario is simple. There's also a precedent. The Dominion failed to fully subdue Hammerfell, which is geographically much closer to Eleanor and far more accessible by sea. Even after the Empire withdrew, Hammerfell fought the Dominion to a stalemate over 5 years. Southern Hammerfell was devastated, but it did not fall. And there's a credible argument that if the Empire had continued the war after the Battle of Red Ring, instead of signing the Concordat, that the Dominion might have been defeated outright. Could Skyrim survive alone? I think it's possible. It would be costly, it would be a long war, but given geography and distance from the Dominion heartlands and defensive terrain, survival's not unrealistic. A unified Skyrim has a far better chance than people give credit. Not only do I say that, guerrilla wars are rarely won by invaders, and I think that precedent would stand if the Dominion tried to invade Skyrim. Now the second question, could the Empire survive without Skyrim? I think there's a real argument that losing Skyrim meaningfully weakens the Empire. Skyrim supplies a large number of legionnaires. Nord soldiers are not a small part of Imperial military strength. Removing manpower before the Second Great War would hurt the Empire. At the same time, we should not overstate the Dominion's strength. The Aldmeri Dominion was heavily weakened by the Great War, as was the Empire, but the Battle of Red Ring destroyed the Dominion's main Cyrodiilic army. Then, they had to fight Hammerfell for 5 more years to a standstill. This was not a clean victory for the Elves. And it's worth remembering, during the Skyrim Civil War, the Empire hasn't actually lost its own legions. The war in Skyrim is largely fought with local forces and minimal Imperial commitment. Tullius himself says he's operating with limited resources because the real legions are poised elsewhere preparing. So it's possible that an empire without Skyrim focuses entirely on defending Cyrodiil and High Rock. A smaller defensive perimeter is easier to fortify. Fewer provinces means fewer fronts to protect. But overall, I still think the odds shift against the Empire if Skyrim leaves. They would lose a lot of manpower. Now the third question, if the Empire falls, does Skyrim fall with it? This is where the conversation gets interesting. What does the Empire fall mean? The Dominion's original demand before the Great War didn't include annexing any of Cyrodiil. They wanted tribute, political concessions, territorial adjustments in Hammerfell, and the disbanding of the Blades and the Talos Ban. Their war was framed as a war against the Empire, not an outright war to conquer every human province permanently. If the Dominion defeats the Empire in a second war, do they annex Cyrodiil? That would be extremely difficult to hold. Occupying the heartland of the Empire would mean constant rebellion. Controlling High Rock, Cyrodiil, and possibly Hammerfell would stretch their logistics significantly. It's more likely that they would impose another treaty, a vassalized empire, political dominance, religious control, tribute, and influence. And here's the key point. If Skyrim is independent at that point, it's no longer part of the empire they're at war with. The Dominion's stated objective has been the Empire, not all of humanity. Not Skyrim specifically. The Thalmor refer to the first conflict as the First War against the Empire. So if the Empire collapses or is reduced to a compliant client state, the Dominion may consider their mission accomplished. Would they eventually turn north? Maybe, but invading Skyrim through mountain passes and frozen northern waters is a different logistical challenge than pushing into nearby Cyrodiil. There's also the question of cost versus reward. Does occupying Skyrim give them enough strategic value to justify another multi-year campaign in brutal terrain? It's not an obvious question. If the Empire falls, Skyrim does not automatically fall with it. And when you say fall, what does that actually look like? Total annexation is unlikely. Political domination is more plausible. An independent Skyrim may not be the immediate target in that scenario. Don't worry, if you're screaming at your monitor about the towers, I'm about to touch on that. But lastly, I want to touch on one final question here. This is an argument I've seen constantly, is that in some way, Skyrim is morally wrong for leaving the Empire because the Empire doesn't stand a chance without it. That's nonsense. We have to say it. Abandoning an imperial power that subjugates you because they may lose a future war is not morally dubious in any way. It is not Skyrim's responsibility to make sure the Empire has hegemony over all of Tamriel. Whether the Empire flourishes or falls should not be the responsibility of Skyrim. I don't think that should be controversial. As I said, we'll touch on it in a second, but I don't think that there's any indication that the Elves are going to try to conquer all of Tamriel. And even if they want to, isn't that also the same goal as the Empire? Okay, now we're going to talk about the towers, because this comes up constantly. The tower theory is the idea that the Aldmeri Dominion is trying to control or deactivate a series of metaphysical towers across Tamriel in order to unmake reality, erase mankind, or collapse Mundus entirely. The theory usually goes like, the towers stabilize reality. If the Thalmor control or disable them, they can undo the world and return it to some pre-Mundus state of existence. It sounds dramatic, cosmic, and makes the Civil War feel like the front line of an apocalyptic metaphysical conflict. The problem is, there is no in-game lore source that confirms this is the Dominion's goal. None whatsoever. Not in Skyrim, Oblivion, Morrowind, any official text. The foundation of this theory comes from an out-of-game commentary, primarily from Michael Kirkbride, and even then, it's elusive, vague, and never formally established. It is a fan interpretation that has been repeated enough online that many people now treat it as confirmed lore. It isn't. Are there metaphysical towers in Elder Scrolls lore? Yes. Are they important? Yes. Is there explicit evidence that the Aldmeri Dominion's war effort is a coordinated plan to deactivate them or destroy reality? No. There is zero direct textual support tying the Dominion's political or military actions in the Fourth Era to an active, confirmed tower collapse strategy. I find this to be an escalation of the argument that it is Skyrim's responsibility to stay inside of the Empire, because if they don't, the whole world will be destroyed. That's not the case. Now, if you personally enjoy the theory, that's fine. It's a fun framework. If that's your headcanon and it makes the Empire feel like the last line of defense against cosmic annihilation, that's totally valid as a personal interpretation. And I think it's actually really cool to have your own personal lore. I totally agree. You should be able to do that, and I totally respect it. And if that's why you picked the Imperials, more power to you. But when we're evaluating the Civil War as an objective political and military conflict, we can't treat Reddit theories as established fact. If someone's primary argument is the Thalmor are trying to destroy the world, therefore the Empire must win, that argument is built on pure speculation with no lore sources. If we're going to have a serious discussion about who should win, we need to separate confirmed information from extrapolated fan theory. So for the purpose of this debate, the tower theory is completely off the table. We're sticking to what the games, the lore actually supports as being true. Like I said, if this is your in-headcanon theory, I love it. I have my own. But for the purpose of this, we're just going to talk about objective facts that are based in lore. Therefore, there's no substance to this argument. Okay, let's talk about the Thalmor dossier. This is one of the most cited arguments in this entire debate. People will say Ulfric is a Thalmor asset, as if that means he's secretly working for them or being controlled by them. That's not what the dossier says. Here's the background. During the Great War, Ulfric left the Greybeards to fight for the Empire. He was captured early in the conflict and interrogated by the Thalmor. He was tortured. During that interrogation, he gave them information. According to the dossier, the Thalmor considered the information operationally insignificant. However, they deliberately allowed Ulfric to believe that what he had revealed had been crucial to the fall of the Imperial city. They manipulated his perception. They did not brainwash him. They did not recruit him, and they do not control him. Later, they allowed him to escape. In the dossier, Ulfric is labeled as an asset, but in intelligence terms, an asset does not mean an agent. That is something that a lot of people confuse. It does not mean you're a loyal operative. It means someone whose actions, knowingly or unknowingly, serve in your interest. The Thalmor explicitly state that a prolonged civil war in Skyrim weakens the Empire and benefits the Dominion. From that perspective, Ulfric's rebellion is useful to them, making him an asset. That's it. He's not taking orders from them. He's not a sleeper agent. He's not a puppet. He's acting independently in pursuit of Nordic sovereignty. But the outcome of his actions helps the Dominion's short-term objective of destabilizing the Empire. Now, how compelling is that argument? Well, if you're strongly pro-Empire, it is compelling. A divided Empire is easier to defeat in the next war. If the Dominion's goal is to weaken or subdue the Empire, then Ulfric is objectively helping them by fracturing Imperial unity. That's a fair point. On the other hand, if you're viewing this from a neutral or pro-Skyrim lens, the label asset doesn't carry much weight. Anyone opposing the Empire during this period is, by definition, indirectly helping the Dominion. That would include rebels, separatists, and even provinces that resist Imperial policy. If the Dominion's primary objective is defeating or weakening the Empire, then any anti-Imperial movement becomes useful to them. This doesn't make every anti-Imperial actor morally compromised. This is not the MK Ultra brainwashing that I see a lot of comments suggest it is. So to sum it up, I don't think the dossier proves Ulfric is secretly aligned with the Thalmor. It does show that the Thalmor see strategic value in the Civil War continuing, and that is worth considering, but this doesn't condemn Ulfric Stormcloak in any way, shape, or form. As I alluded to in the last part, If you don't care whether or not the Empire wins, then this doesn't really matter to you. I think if you look at this from a neutral perspective, not a pro-Imperial perspective, that becomes more apparent. Before we wrap this up, the last argument I want to talk about is the Talos Ban. Because this is the part that Imperial supporters often downplay. The White-Gold Concordat didn't just redraw borders, it did not just disband the Blades, it outlawed the worship of Talos across the Empire. This is state-enforced religious persecution. Let's call it what it is. For many Nords, Talos is not just a historical figure, he is their god. He is the founder of the Empire, he represents human ascendancy. Removing him from the Pantheon is not a technical theological argument, it is a forced denial of faith. And the Empire didn't just quietly ignore the ban forever. After the Markarth Incident, the Empire allowed Thalmor Justiciars to operate inside its borders to enforce the prohibition. That includes arrests, imprisonment, and the murder of Talos worshippers. Now, I've seen Imperial defenders say it was necessary, it was strategic, they had no choice. Strategically, that argument makes sense. The Empire was exhausted, and another war might have meant collapse. Signing the Concordat bought time. But from the perspective of a devout Talos worshipper in Skyrim, that clause alone may have been unacceptable. In the real world, if you believe in God, he's real in your world. And in the Elder Scrolls, gods are demonstrably real. That means banning their worship is not symbolic, it's existential. I've seen the argument that wars in the name of religion are bad. In real-world terms, that's a reasonable moral stance. But Tamriel is not our real world. In Tamriel, divine beings tangibly intervene in history. Tiber Septim demonstrably altered reality. The divine is not abstract philosophy. So to tell a Nord, just accept that your god is illegal now, it's politically necessary. It's not a minor concession. Now, does that justify starting a civil war during a fragile post-war recovery? That's the real question. You could say the Empire did not have to sign the Concordat. It chose to. It chose survival over principle, and that is why this issue cannot be waved away as a minor political compromise. As I think I've already fairly debunked, I see the argument that Stormcloaks are racist. Those same people who will make that argument will gloss over the fact that religious persecution is accepted. This includes the murder of Talos worshippers who try to worship in secret. I've also seen the argument that the ban of Talos wasn't enforced up until the Markarth Incident. While that's not necessarily true, it is a half-truth. The ban technically existed immediately after the White-Gold Concordat, but it was not aggressively enforced everywhere at first. Yes, the Markarth Incident significantly escalated the enforcement in Skyrim. So was it Ulfric's fault? It kind of depends on your perspective. The pro-Empire version would be that the Empire was quietly tolerating Talos worship. Ulfric forced the issue, making it public. That gave the Thalmor political leverage to demand stricter enforcement, so his actions triggered the crackdown. There is some logic to that, but the counterpoint would be that the Thalmor were always going to push for enforcement. The Concordat gave them the legal right to do so. The Empire was technically violating the treaty terms by ignoring the ban. Eventually, the Dominion would have applied pressure regardless. Ulfric may have accelerated the enforcement, but he did not create the ban. He did not invent the Concordat, and he did not negotiate those terms. The legal framework for religious persecution already existed. What Markarth Incident did was made the contradiction more visible. I would say, yes, you could argue that Ulfric's actions did trigger stricter enforcement, but you cannot argue that the ban itself was harmless or non-existent before him. The reason stricter enforcement was allowed to happen in the first place was because the Empire allowed the ban to exist to begin with. As I said, he did not create the ban, he did not invent the Concordat, and he did not negotiate those terms. That would be on the Empire. But I do think that there is somewhat of an argument here if they just left it alone. Maybe it would have just went away. I doubt it, though. So after walking through all of the arguments, here is where I land. There is a couple solid Imperial arguments. The strongest ones are strategic. Can Skyrim realistically defend itself from a future Aldmeri invasion? And what does it look like for Skyrim if Cyrodiil loses the next Great War? Those two questions are serious concerns. If you're pro-Empire, that's your best ground. But outside of those 2 points, I think most of the Imperial arguments collapse under any scrutiny. The execution at Helgen doesn't necessarily define the Empire, but it does show that they are okay with summarily executing basically anybody, including the future Dragonborn. The argument Ulfric is a Thalmor asset is completely overstated and kind of only exists in a quick one-liner. The tower theory is a fan theory with no actual lore backing. The idea that banning a god is just an unfortunate political inconvenience is, to me, not a serious moral defense. The argument that the Stormcloaks are racist in some way is completely debunked. The argument that Ulfric himself or the Stormcloak movement is racist in some way is just patently false. At the end of the day, Skyrim is an imperial province held inside of an imperial structure. The empire was built through conquest. It remains unity through consolidation. That doesn't automatically make it evil, but it does mean that Skyrim's desire for self-governance is legitimate. They have the right to govern themselves, they have the right to worship their god, they have the right to exist outside of an imperial system if that's what they choose. So yes, I am firmly Stormcloak. I think once you strip away all of the fear-based arguments and fan theories, the only true, strong imperial case rests on a hypothetical future invasion. And to me, that isn't enough to override sovereignty. Now, I ran a poll and it looks like most of you guys are actually Imperial, which is great, because that's where discussions are interesting. To me, it's not super fun to kind of just agree with each other. The disagreement is really, really fun, and that is actually what I enjoy the most. If you think I missed something, point it out. If you think one of my strategic assumptions is wrong, tell me why. If you think the Empire's long-term position is stronger than I give it credit for, make the case. But keep it respectful, push back hard if you want to. I'm always open to having my mind changed. But as of right now, Skyrim belongs to the Nords. That being said, if you enjoyed this video, please, I put a ton of work into it. Like, comment, subscribe, and check out our game Winterreach Emporium on Steam. Give it a wish list. It helps out more than you think, even if you're not going to buy the game. But most importantly, thank you for spending your time watching this video. I really appreciate it. Have a great day.